everybody. Welcome people here in the room. Welcome to everybody at home, connecting from remote, to another seminar organized by the Abstraction project and the Abstraction group, funded by a ERC starting grant. Here I'm sharing the screen. I'm showing the homepage of one of the two websites of Abstraction. This is the more academic website, and I'm sharing it because this seminar, like all the other seminars organized by Abstraction, will be recorded, and the recording can be found after the seminar. Give us a day or something, a couple of days. It will be found here on the tab, on the English tab, recorded seminars. And so we will post the seminar that we are hosting today here on the website. Abstraction, as I mentioned, is an ERC-funded research project that has a duration of 5 years. It started 1.5 years, almost 2 years ago, and it will run until May 2027. And the goal of the project is to understand the role of language in helping us abstracting from experience and making sense of what we see, what we experience, what we live, what's going on around us. Within this project, we are organizing a series of seminars addressed to students, but also to colleagues, to researchers, postdocs, PhD students, and more senior scholars. And today, in particular, we have the pleasure of hosting Anna Werkmann Horvat. Anna is currently assistant professor in the Department of English at the Faculty of Humanities and Social Sciences in Osijek, in Croatia. She is focusing, her research is focused on semantics, pragmatics, and psycholinguistics. She uses psycholinguistic methods to address research questions in semantics and pragmatics. And briefly, Anna obtained her bachelor degree and her first master at the University of Osijek, but then she moved abroad, very abroad, to Canada and obtained a second master in linguistics from the University of Ottawa, or Ottawa, as she says. Yeah. And after that, after this Canadian experience, Anna moved to the University of Oxford, where she completed her PhD. And you were at Worcester College, right? Worcester College. Worcester, which is one of the words where many of the letters are not pronounced. Worcester. Worcester. It's written Worcester, it's pronounced Worcester College. And as you may know, Oxford has many different colleges, and there is a very lively student life in all of these colleges. And Anna obtained her PhD there, collaborating and working at the Language and Brain Lab, led by Aditi Langiri, at the Faculty of Linguistics. And there she worked on modalities. So her PhD thesis, which has been recently published as a book by the Frauke, it's called Layers of Modality. And after her PhD, Anna started a postdoc funded by an AHRC, so Arts and Humanities Research Council in the UK, a postdoc in Oxford, and that's where I met her. So I was a postdoc at the University of Oxford, Jesus College. She was a postdoc at the University of Oxford, Worcester College. Fortunately, they're not like competing colleges or and so we worked together because we were funded by the same large project, Creative Multilingualism. It was a huge grant funded by the Arts and Humanities Research Council. Within this large grant, the two of us focused on figurative language, on trying to understand the connection between, the interplay between figurative language and metaphors and multilingualism. These postdocs that we embarked together culminated or ended, let's say, with our pregnancies. No, and it with a very interesting conference that we organized called the Creative Power of Metaphor in 2019. And this was right before COVID, in a way, started. So for this conference, we had invited different panels, and we had planned to edit videos as outputs of the conference. We said, oh, we'll record and prepare videos for the conference. And it all seemed very innovative. And then COVID kicked in, and then everybody was recording stuff because everything was from remote. But I have very good memories, and I'm very grateful that Anna is here today to give a talk on polysemy. And I'm very thankful for her availability to come here to Bologna from Osijek. So yeah, the conference on the creative power of metaphor that we organized back in Oxford ended up also in another publication, another book that we co-authored together this time, called the Metaphor Compass, Directions for Metaphor Research in Language, Cognition, Communication, and Creativity. So I'm also glad that after our postdoc in Oxford, our collaboration and friendship is still continuing. And so I'm very happy to have Anna today here. And I let the floor now to her, which will give a talk on polysemy. The idea is to have a talk for like 45, 50 minutes. No. Yeah, okay. Followed by a Q&A session. And questions and answers can be, of course, we will interact with people in the room, but also with people from home if you want to ask questions. So thank you once again to Anna, and I let the floor to her.
No, I'm trying to. Hopefully, the people online can also see it like this. Andrea, are you?
No, we are still watching.
They're watching
the camera, yes. Okay. We have to move the screen sharing.
Oops. We are screen sharing. Let's see again. Maybe like that.
Yeah.
Can you see? Okay. Presentation view. Oops. Good, yeah? Okay, so today's talk is going to be about, I'd say, my favorite language phenomenon. There is polysemy, and I work from it from various perspectives, starting with modality, and you can imagine modality is also very polysemous, but not usually considered what we think polysemy is. But obviously, when you say you must, this word can have a variety of meanings. So I work on modality, but I also work on figurative and literal meanings. And I work with L1 speakers and L2 speakers. So these are, and as we will see today, two completely different groups, and come with their own methodological challenges when it comes to recruitment, but also testing. And so because of that, today I will talk about some of my new findings. Some of these findings have already been published in a series of papers with Mariana, and some haven't yet. So I'll talk about some very, very recent results, and I'll try to talk about methodological challenges as well, in how we create stimuli, how we test participants, and what goes into testing bilingual participants that's maybe not part of testing monolingual participants. Okay, so I'll start with obviously polysemy. And so I want to just simply put it, so polysemy is a language phenomenon in which one word can have two meanings or two senses, and usually these two meanings are somehow related, okay? So they need to be related. So I have an example here. The word house can mean a house, like its very primary core literal meaning, very concrete, or house as in Hogwarts houses. So it's like an organization within a school, but obviously it can also be a publishing house. That's also one meaning of the word house. And so this phenomenon seems to be very universal across languages. So it seems that it's something that human languages love to do. And there is a bit of a question behind why human languages love to do that. Because when you think about polysemy, having one form and two meanings can be actually quite confusing, right? So you'd expect I have one form and it means this one thing. So, but human languages love this ability to encode two different meanings in one form, and they seem to use it in its favor. How? So what we know from psycholinguistics, and not only for polysemy, we only know this from a variety of syntactic issues. So for instance, what people love to do is they love to go with the simplest interpretation, right? Why? So humans are, let's say, notorious for loving easy cognitive processes, right? So if they can do something in an easy way, they'll do it. So what seems to be easy in the case of polysemy is the fact that you only need to remember one word, right? And then you combine it with two different meanings. And so this seems to be the reason why human languages do it. And the ambiguity is not such a big issue. And so you can guess that the ambiguity is often fixed by the context. And so human languages actually love polysemy because it helps you remember less things. And if there's anything humans love is this language economy, you know, doing less with less, not more, right? So less forms. So if you can get it with less forms, let's just do it that way. However, this might be how it works for L1 speakers, but what we do know from the literature, and this is sort of like the prevailing view in the literature, L2 speakers find it hard to do this. And so for L2 speakers, it's not easy, and this benefit does not come without the cost. And so some of these early studies that I listed here, these were not online processing studies, these were longitudinal studies. And so for instance, Schmidt, and this is a widely cited studies when you do work on L2 polysemy. So Schmidt found that when words have more than one meaning, most of participants do not acquire all of the meanings of these words, just some partial, they only basically have partial knowledge of the meanings of this word, while for L1 speakers, you would expect them to know all of the meanings of the word. Then Crossley and colleagues found that this was also a longitudinal study. So learners produce highly frequent and polysymous nouns. So first of all, let's say something about highly frequent and polysymous nouns. So highly frequent nouns are most of the time polysymous, right? And so because highly frequent words are simple in form, we tend to use that form many times. And so like the word house, it's a very basic word. It's acquired very early on in L1 acquisition and in L2 acquisition. So it has many, many meanings, right? And so Crossley and colleagues found that learners actually do start producing them quite early. So it's not the form or the word itself that's difficult, but what happens usually is that first the core meanings are acquired, and then later on in the language acquisition, they develop these less central meanings. So it seems like they start with what we could perhaps kind of guess, start with more concrete, primary, literal meanings, and later on they develop less central meanings. So here we might also talk about proficiency. So it's later on, it probably has to do something with proficiency as well. And as we'll see throughout my talk, proficiency can be an important factor in how we comprehend anything in our L2. And so, importantly, not many studies have been done on L2 polysemy that were actually online processing studies, so where we actually explore real-time comprehension of polysymous meanings. One of these studies is Crossley and Skalicki from 2017. And so they did a priming study where they explored dominant and subordinate meanings. So here, again, there is a difference in terminology, but these would be sort of core meanings, some very sort of central meanings of a word, and then less central meanings of the word. And so they found that L1 participants exhibit a priming effect. So they are sensitive to dominant senses, but this was not found for L2 speakers. So L2 speakers seem to have weaker associations between meanings of the words, and they don't even have it for the dominant meanings. And we'll see that in some of our studies, we also found similar results. So now I just wanted to say something about So is this on the presentation like this, or maybe I should move it here? Like this? Okay. Okay, so in L2 acquisition, something's happening that's not happening in L1 acquisition. So as I said, the L1 often plays a role. And so when you acquire your L2, your concepts are already acquired, right? But when you're acquiring your L1, you first need to learn what a tree is. So what it looks like, where it is, right? Where you'll find it, what the concept is, and then you relate it to the form. But when you start learning your L2, for most, at least for all concrete things, you'll already have the concept. So obviously we all know these cases where there are no translations in another language for concepts, and these are very abstract, rare concepts. But usually when we acquire our L2, the concept is already there, and we just need the form. And so here then, for polysymous words, we have this problem for L2 speakers that I exemplified here. So where there are cross-linguistic differences, polysemy can be very difficult. So I here have an example for my native language. So this is a fork in English, and in Croatian is vilica. On the right side, you also have a fork, but this is not vilica, okay? So this means that in English, this word can have different meanings, but in Croatian it can. And so you can imagine how this can create difficulty for an L2 speaker. So first of all, you know this concept, and then in English it's something else as well. And so in a previous life, I spent some time teaching English. And what L2 speakers often said, L2 speakers of all ages and all proficiencies, they said that the most difficult thing for them in English is to learn a word, acquire the knowledge, and then 2 weeks after that, they discover it means something else as well. And so you can see how that can be confusing, right? And so even though polysemy is quite universal across languages, it can also maybe be a bit more prominent in some languages. And it seems that English, because it's quite simple morphologically and syntactically, it actually thrives on polysemy, and it can be quite difficult for L2 speakers. Okay, and so now I'll talk about some variables that affect polysemy comprehension in L2 acquisition and processing. And these are obviously just some variables. This is not an exclusive list, but these are variables that I worked on. And obviously there are more that I hope to work on in the future, but this is basically what we'll cover today in my talk. So I'll start with the number of senses, and I'll combine this with the influence of the L1. So when we talk about the number of senses, we talk about the fact that some polysymous words are highly polysymous. They can have many different meanings, more than 5, even 7, 10. So very high numbers of meanings. L1, so I put here in bracket typology. So obviously, L1 always influences our L2 acquisition at all levels of L2 acquisition. So I'll say a bit more about that when I get to that slide. Proficiency, I think this is maybe the most straightforward variable. Not straightforward in the sense that we always know how to test it and how to form groups, but straightforward in the way that if you would ask anyone, what do you think affects how you would do something in your L2, most of the time the answer would probably be proficiency, right? So obviously we are also, as we learn a different language, we also feel how our comprehension or production changes and becomes better. And finally, something that I worked extensively on, metaphoricity, and here I'll make direct comparison to what's abstract, what's concrete, and we'll talk about how some metaphorical meanings might be more abstract and some not so abstract, and what this might mean for our stimuli, but also our results. Okay, let's start with a very recent study that's not published yet. And so I'll start with the number of senses issue. And so in the very early visual recognition studies, what's been found for L1 speakers is that, and this might sound surprising, it's that words that have more meanings are actually easier to process. And this was explained this way. So basically, when you have a word that has many different meanings, it's easier to activate it, right? Because it's sort of more salient in your mind because it has many meanings. And importantly, this was later on only found in, it was shown that it might be only in polysemy, not homonymy, and polysemy is related senses. So it helps when the senses are related. What must be emphasized here is that this effect, the ambiguity advantage effect, is not free of debate. So there have been studies that have shown the opposite results, even though it is an old psycholinguistic effect and quite a famous one. And so what we wanted to see is whether L2 learners also benefit from the same advantages. So as I've said, there haven't been many studies in the L2 processing research field on polysemy, and whenever there was anything, it's been found that L2 speakers actually do struggle with polysemy. So in a way, it's difficult to expect the ambiguity advantage for L2 speakers, but we want to see what's out there. And second, quite similar, are L2 speakers even sensitive to this difference? So it's been shown that L1 speakers kind of are sensitive to whether a word has 1 or 2 meanings or 5 and 10. But it might be because L2 speakers are in general sensitive to less things than L1 speakers. It might be that for them it just doesn't matter. There's no difference between these two categories of polysymous words. So how is this connected to the L1? So as we know, all L2 acquisition is undeniably affected by our L1. And why is this? So obviously, we've known now for a while that a bilingual is not 2 monolinguals in one body. And so we cannot really explore the different languages just by looking at their L2 or L1. They are connected. And so what we now know and what most psycholinguistic studies agree on is that at all times, all of our languages are activated. So what does this mean? So as I'm now speaking English, my Croatian is somewhere out there, kind of interfering, wanting me to say this word, not the other, right? And so whenever I hear an English word that starts with the sound B, I'm not going to only activate all the sounds in English that starts with B, I'm going to also activate everything in Croatian. So it can be confusing to be a bilingual, right? Because you have to activate a lot more things. And this is obviously also found in a variety of research studies that show that bilinguals actually do take more time to recognize words and say whether something is a word or not, because they just have more words to activate, right? And so obviously we know that there might be an effect of an L1, and it might also appear in polysemy processing. And so what we ask ourselves in this study is, how does polysemy processing vary depending on what the L1 is, and how is this connected to the number of senses? So we basically explored this relation. This was the experimental design of the task. So I'll start with the design, move on to participants, and then stimuli. So this was a lexical decision task. It was a priming study, and it was intramodal, which means that everything was just written on the screen. There was nothing that was auditory. And so I'll say more about the stimuli, but here we just have an example of how the study looked like. So you see milk, and then after that you see cereal, and you have to say yes or no for whether cereal is a word or not. Or you could see drum, and then you see cereal, and you have to say whether cereal is a word or not. What happens here? So as you can see, the first one is related, the second one is unrelated. So you would expect for milk to prime cereal, so, and then drum should try to prime cereal, but probably couldn't because it's unrelated. And so you would expect the processing time, the time it takes for you to say something is a word or not, to be faster in the related condition. Okay, let's see who the participants were in the study. We have 3 groups of L2 learners here with different L1s, and the L1s were picked according to typological distance from English. We had Korean, French, and Croatian. Not the same size of the groups, but almost the same. And we also had a control group of English speakers And so French was taken to be the closest to English with a lot of borrowings and quite a similar simple morphology. Croatian is actually, according to Walls, morphologically the furthest away from English, but Korean obviously has this difference of a writing system, which plays an important role. And Croatian, you could say that there are some syntactic differences to similarities to English, because we could also have the same word order, but Croatian is actually a free word order language because of its morphological complexity. What did we actually look at? This is the scheme. On the left, you have so nom is the abbreviation for number of meanings. So on the left, you have some examples of words that are either polysymous or not, but they have a low number of senses, so 1 or 2 senses. So it should be quite easy for an L2 speaker, okay? And you can see that these all of these words are quite frequent, should be very well known to L2 speakers, actually. And we did aim for high proficiency L2 speakers. On the right, you have words that have more than four meanings, but this goes, I think, up to like 10. So some words, not all of them, they have a lot of different meanings. And so you can see some of these highly polysymous words: fork, scene, stand, fire, bank. Bank is quite a famous polysymous word, and fire will also see different meanings of the words. And so here on the left, you can see this low polysemy word, like wife in the dictionary. So we extracted the number of meanings from dictionaries. Obviously, there are issues there as well, because it depends on the number of the dictionary you pick, on the type of the dictionary you pick, and on the dictionary, because not everybody takes the same thing to be a sense or a meaning. So obviously, it can be difficult to work with that kind of a stimuli. Okay, so these were our target nouns, our target conditions, and let's see the results. So when I talk about the results, I'll try to present them visually, and so because these results are quite recent, I won't go into any of the models we ran, and because of the type of the talk, and it's not a talk but just about the study, I'll try to keep it visual so we can all sort of get a sense of what was happening. Okay, so we had these 4 languages: French, Korean, Croatian, and English. Let's take a look at what we have here. So for each one of these plots, we have related and unrelated. And basically, to get a sense of the priming effect, you need to compare these two, related versus unrelated. Let's take a look at the first row, which were high, right? So highly polysymous nouns. So these are nouns that had many different meanings. And so what you can see here, for them, at least in this visual representation, there were no significant differences for any of the languages, not even English, okay? So this tells us, first of all, that in this case, there was no ambiguity advantage effect for these words, at least in English. In the second row, you can see that the picture has changed. And so you can see, so I'll explain the results in the next slide, but here I'll just talk about the tendencies. For Croatian, we actually see the biggest difference between the biggest difference here. So it seems that the fact that these are low polysemy nouns really helps, and Croatian people really peer into that and really stick to that and kind of grab the idea, oh yes, I'll use this into my favor. English and French are quite similar here, while Koreans didn't actually make a difference between the high and low polysemy items. So how do we explain these results based on the high versus low, but also the language's difference and the typological distance? And so when we looked at our results in the Croatian group, we had a lot of high proficiency speakers, and it was the furthest typological distance. So it was a language that's quite far away from English. And what turns out to be the case is that these participants were actually highly sensitive to difference in meanings, and they really liked it when they get a low polysemy item. They were the priming effect was quite clear, and we interpret this as showing that they actually rely on this sensitivity more than the other speakers, as Croatian is relatively less polysymous. And so they need to develop a tactic on how to deal with these polysemous words. And so when they get a word that's not very polysemous, they're actually quite good at figuring out this is a word. French. So here I'm talking about dependencies and not significance, because in the model it wasn't, these things were significant, but there is definitely a tendency. So in French there is a tendency similar to, as in Croatian it was a lot stronger. In French there was a tendency to differ between these high and low, and in English as well. And what we found is that French is closest typologically, but also has more similar processing to English. And this is probably due to the fact that in their L1, they also deal with polysemy in the same way as they need to deal with it in their L2. Korean, and this is quite an interesting finding, they had the most straightforward priming effect. And why? Because they didn't make a difference between high and low. And why don't they make a difference between high and low? Because they just aren't sensitive to that. Now, this could be due to typological distance, but they were also slightly less proficient, which is sort of like a confounding factor here. But what so the interpretation that we take here is that basically there is greater typological distance, and there is a different writing system. So this might play a big role in visual recognition study, obviously. And because of that, they pay attention less to the things that may not matter when you need to decide whether something is a word or not. So in a way, the smaller sensitivity can be a processing advantage, right? So not knowing what's happening makes you faster in the related items, which is quite interesting, because what we often see in bilinguals is that we have a processing disadvantage. So maybe sometimes if you're less proficient, or maybe don't know the language so well, maybe this can be a processing advantage. There's some methodological issues. So obviously L2 speakers are very complex groups, and it can be very, very difficult to recruit them. Why? So when you think about L1 acquisition is universal wherever you go. And this is the first thing you'll learn about L1 acquisition when you learn about it. We all reach similar milestones everywhere in the world. It might depend on morphology and things like that by month or two, but we follow the same milestones, the same trajectory, right? And so L1 acquisition is often very similar, and L1 comprehension processes, when you're an adult, are quite similar. So L1 groups are uniform groups, and we can sort of make better expectations and better hypotheses on how they will behave. However, when you want to recruit L2 speakers, you might have an L2 speaker who acquired a language maybe a bit early on. Maybe they're also more, I'm not sure if you can say it that way, but talented for languages or something. I feel like everybody has the same talent for L1, but everybody has the same talent for their L2. Then somebody might spend a year in another country, another person might not. They might not always report that in the language background questionnaire. So you get a group that's very unpredictable, right? And so you might also ask for highly advanced speakers, and then they might not be highly advanced speakers. So there's a variety of issues in how to recruit L2 speakers, and we definitely cannot expect the same things from them as we can from L1 speakers. And again, this is tied back to the fact that bilinguals are not two bilinguals in the same body. It's just such a complex, it's a complex trajectory to get to being an advanced L2 speaker. Okay, then stimuli. Stimuli is always an issue, in my opinion, when you work with such sensitive differences in meanings. And so we know that there is this famous ambiguity advantage effect. And then we try to compare it with some other polysemous words, but what might actually be the case is that we're basically comparing apples to pears, right? And so stimuli could always be a bit different, and then you're basically testing a different thing. And so I'll talk about this when we come to metaphor in polysemy, and this is something that Mariana and I worked on. But so what might be a problem, for instance, in this? So let's say we picked some words that are very highly polysemous, but then in those words, we found a lot of words that have many abstract meanings, for instance. So these might be more different. And so this is unfortunately not the thing that we paid attention to in this study, but this is definitely something that would be worth controlling for in future studies. So what sort of meanings are the meanings of the words, right? So you might say this word is highly polysymous, it has 5 meanings. This word has also 5 meanings, but all of these 5 words, 5 meanings could be concrete, and all of these, they might not, right? So this is just sort of like a hypothetical situation, and all of these might be abstract. Will this be the same? Will the processing be the same? So these are some of the questions that I think we need to ask ourselves in the future studies. Okay, let's go to metaphoricity and polysemy. So I don't think I mentioned yet, but maybe, so I mentioned that we worked on figurative language, but what's the one thing that's important about metaphor and metonymy and polysemy is that metaphor and metonymy are basically the basic main generators of polysemy in language. And so they're obviously then directly connected to the issue of polysemy. So let's take a look at the word fire. Here's a dictionary entry. So the first meaning you have here is it's for, let's say, the primary meaning, the meaning that all the other meanings get extended from. So the phenomenon of combustion manifested in light, flame, and heat. And then under B, you already have burning passion, right? Young lovers with their hearts full of fire. So the first, and you can see that this is here in this dictionary at least. This is all under sort of one sense and sort of subsenses. And under one sense, you have the main meaning and then the main metaphorical meaning. So dictionaries can be also a mess when you try to get what's the number of the senses and how polysymous a word is. And so here you can see, so for instance, how you can extend metaphorically the meaning of the word fire to get this new meaning, burning passion. There are also, so you can also get, so the first example of house being a house and then extended to the organization, that's a metonymic extension, right? So this is these are examples of how we get different meanings by metaphoric and metonymic processes. And you can see how many different meanings, and sometimes in different dictionaries, some of these meanings might be put under one meaning or more meanings. So depending on what the lexicographer decides to do when they start constructing the dictionary, this is the look of the entry that you will have. Okay. I'm mainly talking about L2 in this talk. But what I wanted to say is something about L1 acquisition as well, because this is something that I'm also currently working on. And so when we talk about L2 acquisition, we assume that maybe polysemy is never difficult for L1 speakers. But actually in the metaphor literature, in figurative language literature, there have always been this finding that metaphor is actually quite difficult to acquire. And very early research said that metaphor is acquired by very, very late, when you're 8 years old. And if you know anything about L1 acquisition, this is actually quite late, right? So usually kids, when they're 5, they already can talk about anything and everything. And so then recent studies actually challenged this view and said, no, actually metaphorical competence starts at the age of 3 and continues to improve until the age of 7. And so in the study that I will be talking about now, what we wanted to see is whether maybe in polysymous words that have very conventional meanings, whether this happens when you're 3 or older, or maybe even earlier. So whether there is actually, whether this metaphoric disadvantage in language acquisition applies for all metaphors the same, because obviously metaphors can be different. They can be of the A is B type, right? Life is a journey, but they can also be very conventional, which is often found in polysemy. So initially in this area, literal meanings, so the core meanings, the ones that are said to be historically earlier, acquired easier, usually the more concrete meanings, it's been always claimed that they're acquired first, and then the more abstract, more metaphorical meanings follow these meanings. So as for the metaphor acquisition research, the recent studies show that there are other factors like context and obviously stimuli that's been used that actually contributed to this view that metaphor is acquired quite late. But recently there has been more and more research that kind of challenges this view. There has been research that has shown that historically it's not always the more concrete meaning that comes first. Obviously this is rare, but it's the first research of this kind. And so what we try to see here, whether this is true for language acquisition as well. So when we talk about polysymous items, very conventional meanings, is it true that literal is always also acquired first? Here are some of the research questions regarding this topic that we want to answer. First of all, at which age do children start producing metonymically and metaphorically polysymous words using their different meanings? Is the literal meaning of polysymous words always produced prior to the figurative one? And what is the ratio of metonymically versus metaphorically polysymous words, and how does this change over time? To do this, we use language acquisition on L1 corpus, and this is a corpus that tracks a single child from when they start speaking to when they're 7 years old, so basically until language acquisition is kind of done. We extracted all the nouns and the verbs. There was a lot more nouns than the verbs, which is quite usual in the speech of young children. And using the dictionary, we listed different meanings, and then we annotated different meanings as being literal, metaphorical, or metonymic. I'll show you an example of what we've done. So remember, it was 641 nouns and 247 verbs, and for each one of these words, we did this. So basically, we take all the occurrences of the word, right? When I speak of numbers, it's not that easy. You would take the word, and then basically you would take a look at whether it's literal or metaphorical. And so you can see here that for the word way, there's a lot of metaphorical use very, very early on. So as you know, the word way can be used to mean manner, for instance, and so that's metaphorical. Okay. Here's what we found for nouns. So the blue thing is metonymy, the orange thing is metaphor. And so if you take a look at the tendencies, you'll see that metonymy starts quite early on, from the beginning of the corpus, from the first recording of the child. And then metaphor also kind of starts early, but then it's quite rare. And then it becomes more and more frequent, while metonymy kind of dies down. So there seems to be a significant correlation with, especially for time and metaphor. And so, while metonymy stays kind of constant over time, metaphor becomes more and more important as you get older. But what's important here is that we can see that there are very early uses of metaphoric meanings. So children are able to use abstract meanings of nouns very early on. They are rare, and you can see all that gray, that's literal. So obviously the literal is what they're all about, but we are as well, right, in adults, right? But what's important is the blue and the orange, and how metaphor grows with time. It's slightly different for verbs, and this is because verbs tend to be a bit more metaphorical than metonymic. And so you can see that metaphor is used more for verbs than metonymy, but also metonymy does start a bit early on. And metaphor appears for verbs around the same time and starts being substantially used as for nouns, but then it really grows, right? And it grows with time, and it becomes more and more frequent. But again, what's quite important for these results is that we have shown that at least for conventional meanings, polysymous nouns, these abstract metaphorical meanings appear quite early and much earlier than previously claimed. So we found evidence of 1 year, 5 months. So this is when basically kids start producing their first words. But what we can talk about is early primacy of metonymy. So metonymy does appear earlier than metaphor. but it's, metaphor appears several months later, 1.9, so 1 year, 9 months, but still much earlier than previously considered, right? So, other research said, oh, between 3 and 8 years, this is early on. And as I said, literal meanings are more frequent, but sometimes, in some cases, figurative meanings we found produced even before the literal ones. So what are some possible questions, especially regarding abstractness? So first, we might say metaphor is acquired later due to later acquisition of abstract notions. And this has something to do maybe with the cognitive processes that you need to create metaphor and to connect concrete and abstract concepts. Because this is what you do when you create metaphorical concepts, right? And so, because it might be that due to cognitive development, you're only able to do that later on. However, based on our new finding, this is still earlier than initially believed. So how come? So this might be due to the way these nouns and these meanings are conventional, right? So it might be that early on, you're not even doing anything, any abstraction, you're just acquiring these meanings. So as a small child, you might not be aware that these are extension of meanings, right? And then something is more abstract, something is more concrete. You're acquiring these meanings, but you are able to acquire them because they are very, very conventional. So there are sort of two sides to the coin, right? Yes, you're acquiring these metaphorical meanings, but are you really acquiring the metaphoricity of them? That's the question. Okay, so we already mentioned the importance of good stimuli, and this is something that Mariana and I worked on in this paper here that I'm citing. And so what we saw in this paper as the biggest issue with creating stimuli is the fact that we often have papers saying that they're researching the same thing. But what's actually happening is there's a variety of metaphorical expressions, a variety of different stimuli, and basically your results might be the results that you got, but they're not answering the same research questions. So what we draw our attention to here in this paper is the fact that when we talk about research questions and about what's happening with metaphor or polysemy or anything similar to that, you need to be thinking about what kind of stimuli did I use to explore this question, and whether this is the same or similar stimuli that the people in previous studies use. So we need to be very careful in the interpretation of our results, especially comparing them to the previous studies, but also when setting up the questions, we need to be careful. So like right in the beginning of the study. And so in this experiment, we explored the dominance of literal and metaphorical meanings. And so what we wanted to see, so what we claim is that when you're trying to explore literal and metaphorical meanings, you need to be sure that you're actually exploring meanings of the same dominance. So let's take an example. So let's take the verb support. So when you think of the verb support, you think of, I'm going to support my friend through a difficult time. And so obviously this is not the literal meaning of that word, and this is not the most concrete meaning of the word, but it seems to be the most dominant meaning. Maybe for L2 speakers, but also L1 speakers as well. And if you take a look at the corpus, this is what you'll find as well. The literal meaning, and maybe the primary meaning, and what you will find as the first meaning in the dictionary is, for instance, a being like this in this room supporting the roof, right? So some sort of a physical support. So what does this tell us? This tells us that the literal, the most concrete meaning of the word is not always the most dominant. Does it then make it not the primary meaning? That's the question as well. Imagine then L1 or L2 acquisition. Do you think that this is the meaning that the child will first acquire? The child will first acquire the meaning that they hear the most, right? And so this will probably be support, as in emotional support. So there is a variety of questions that are related to this issue, whether something, how can something be primary or secondary? Does this depend on the context? Does this depend on your L1 or L2? So there's a variety of questions there, but what our basic claim was is that you need to control for that when you're studying metaphor in any kind of experimental way. And obviously here, we also have the questions that most of the abstraction group is concerned with whether then abstractness of these meanings also changes the stimuli and the results. Okay. So the experiment, these were actually 2 experiments reporting 2 different papers. First, we wanted to see the differences between processing literal and conventional metaphorical meanings of polysymous words when the dominance is controlled for by L1 speakers. So the first for L1 speakers, and then we wanted to see whether the same thing happens for L2 speakers. Okay, so the participants, L1 speakers are British English. We had 48 of them. L2 speakers, 27 of the C1, C2 proficiency, so advanced proficiency, and 27 of intermediate proficiency. So 2 different groups. What about this, the procedure? So this was not an intramodal task, it was a cross-modal task. What does that mean? So it means that participants heard the prime, but saw the target. So what would happen in an experiment? The participants would first hear cash, and then after the word cash finishes, what they see on the screen is the target, invest. You have to say whether invest is a word or not, okay? Or for instance, so this was the literal condition. I'll go into more details on the stimuli on the next slide. And then we have another condition, metaphorical. So you might hear effort, you see invest, and then you have to say whether invest is a word or not. And the last one was unrelated, so garden, invest, yes or no. Let's see the stimuli. So we had 48 polysymous verbs. They all had a variety of meanings, but we focused in this experiment on 2 meanings that we were targeting. And so what we were trying to do with this special verb-object relationship is target either the metaphorical or the literal meaning. How? So let's take a look at invest that we have already seen. So you can invest cash and you can also invest effort. So what we thought, when you hear effort, and then you see invest, you need to activate the metaphorical meaning of invest, not the finance meaning of invest. When you see cash, and then when you hear cash and then you see invest, then you're activating the finance meaning of invest. And so what did we do here to control for dominance? So for each one of these combinations, we actually checked Sketch Engine, and we tried to pick the combinations that do not appear significantly more or less than the other. So they were all matched for dominance. So this means that digest milk and digest news appear similarly in a corpus. Same goes for devour pizza or devour a novel. And so you can see how these are metaphorical. Touch ground, touch heart, cover floor or cover a story, expose skin, and expose fruit. And then obviously these are unrelated primes that we use as a control group. Okay, I'll try to explain it visually on the next slide, but just to say that there were significant differences between the groups and there was a correlation between condition and group. Let's see what happened with what happens with the native speakers. So what we got when dominance was controlled for, we found differences between literal and unrelated, so significant differences, metaphorical and unrelated, but also basically no differences. You can see this is 2 milliseconds difference between literal and metaphorical, right? So what does this tell us? So we interpret these results, so no significant differences between literal and metaphorical condition, and importantly as well, no significant differences between literal and the control, right? Unrelated and metaphorical and control. But basically, for these kind of cases, when you do control for dominance, there is no primacy of literal in polysymous words. But then this also appears to be the question that's connected to this. So you've seen that obviously investing effort is a lot more of an abstract process than investing cash, right? It would be even difficult to kind of explain it. What does it mean to invest effort, right? So does this mean that abstract meanings are potentially not more difficult if they're very conventional, right? So these are very conventional meanings and matched in this dominance in the context for the concrete processes as well. So this is something maybe to think about in our further research, future research. Okay, about the L2 speakers. So I decided to start with intermediate proficiency because they're also it's kind of like it's a natural order. Oh, I'm missing error lines here. Sorry. So what we found in this data set is quite uneventful, but in line with previous research. So basically, there were no significant priming effects for intermediate groups. Why? Probably because they're not sensitive enough to these meanings. And this is in line with previous research on polysemy and on polysemic meanings. What about advanced proficiency speakers? And so for metaphorical, we didn't find any differences between unrelated, and there weren't no significant differences between literal and metaphorical. But something very interesting was happening in literal versus unrelated. And so what we saw here is not a priming effect, but a negative priming effect. So it seems that when people get a literal, more concrete meaning of this verb, then they take more time to say this is a word or not than in the unrelated condition. Why? Let's first start with the intermediate group that had nothing. So obviously they're not proficient enough, it seems, to be sensitive to this type of semantic priming. It can be considered quite a subtle semantic priming because there's this connection between the verb and the object. But what the advanced group shows is that there is an interference or a negative priming effect between literal and unrelated. And it seems that L2 speakers of advanced proficiency, at least, are aware of the connection between the literal and the target. And then when they're aware, they're thinking more about it. And so this is something that has been found in previous research on L2 speakers. L2 speakers have sort of heightened awareness of language processes, and this is something that L1 speakers don't do. So when most often we are a lot more automatic about our L1 than our L2. In L2, we seem to be overthinking things sometimes. And so, however, for L2 speakers of advanced proficiency, this was not true for the metaphorical condition. So it seems that they do not have the same awareness for the more difficult condition, which is not more difficult for L1s, remember, just for them. And so they treat it no differently than the unrelated condition. So it is more difficult to create these word associations for L2 speakers than L1 speakers. So for L1 speakers, it seems that the word associations are just a lot stronger, which is in line with previous research on polysemy. And so while one sense of a word can prime another in L1 speakers, it does not happen always in advanced L2 speakers, and it's more difficult for abstract meanings, at least. And so remember, for L1 speakers, this is not always an issue if there is conventionality. However, conventionality is not the same for L2 speakers. Why? So think about how something becomes conventional when it's conventional in your L1. You hear it very early on, you hear it very frequently, your input is steady, and it's just different than how conventionality works in your L2, right? So your L2 input is entirely different than your L1 input. You might start with just one class per week, and then it's often focused on a certain subject that's in the textbook, things like that. So there is a reason why when we want to test for conventionality and familiarity, we test L1 speakers and we norm with L1 speakers, because we do not have the same processes for L2 speakers. So it seems that this factor of something being conventional or not does not help a lot, even when you're a very advanced L2 speakers. And I do know the data very well in this study, and most of these advanced L2 speakers were actually very advanced, so C2 speakers, and they did struggle with metaphorical meanings. Okay, so what about, I don't know how long have I been speaking for? Maybe 40 minutes?
It's 12:04, so you have another 5 minutes.
I'll finish with this then.
Okay.
That's fine, yeah. Okay. I timed it perfectly. Okay, so I've mentioned these issues throughout my talk many times, but I just wanted to sort of summarize it and maybe give us an opportunity to discuss this in our discussion and in these couple of days while I'm here. So what was the question that I've been thinking about is what is the role abstract meanings play in highly polysemous items in both L1 and L2 speakers. So this is what I already talked about, is how you might have polysemous items that have many different meanings, and some of them might be more abstract, and some of them might be more concrete, but this also maybe goes for low polysemy items. And I'm wondering whether this role is the same for L1 and L2 speakers. It might be that for L1, it doesn't matter that much because of the ambiguity advantage effect and because of the fact that they're all conventional, and so they might be easy. And then for L2 speakers, this does play a role, but really who knows, right? So this is something that we need to look at. Obviously, this requires a lot of very detailed, time-consuming work on the stimuli, right? So you need stimuli that would be controlled for what kind of meanings these are. And we all know that sometimes determining what's abstract or what's concrete, or what's metaphorical, what's literal, is not that easy. So how to do that is really something that will be difficult to determine, but also worthy of researching. Does the ambiguity advantage effect hold for meanings at all the levels of abstractness? So as I said, the ambiguity advantage effect is often taken for granted, but there is so much more that hasn't been researched related to this. And finally, related to all of this, could concrete polysemy be easier? So this is what I want to know. So in metaphor, often, so you can see, so when we have a word like fork, and so this second meaning of the word fork is actually quite concrete, right? So it's still a thing that you can imagine in a way. It's a road fork. So this is quite concrete polysemy in a way, while something else like fire, and then fire burning within you, that's actually quite abstract. So it seems like there are different types of polysemy, and this actually is something that hasn't been thought about in previous research, so it's definitely worth looking into. Okay, I'll stop here now with food for thought.
Thank you so much. Okay. Let's see if I can stop sharing this thing. Okay. Thank you, Anna. Are there comments and questions?
Yeah.
Julia.
So thank you very much. It was a very interesting talk. I have some really wanted to ask some details about the last experiment.
Mm-hmm. Can you hear the question from home? The question being asked from the audience here.
Or you can just re-say.
Yeah, I can just repeat it with the summary.
What is the L1? In the last experiment, it was the participants that were studying English, but were
Croatian.
Croatian. And why the cross-modality experiment should be used for priming instead of just like an intermodality experiment? Is there a difference also in hearing or just?
So I think that in some cases, when you do, so there isn't like any definite literature on this, but in some cases, when you do cross-modal priming and you're working with L2 speakers, it might be actually less confusing because the only thing they see is the thing that they need to respond to. And so when you, obviously intermodal paradigms are very frequent, but if you imagine an intermodal paradigm, you see milk and you also see cereal. So what you're then thinking about is quite confusing. But what we found in, well, at least in the L1 experiment, that one is that the cross-modal priming was quite straightforward, and we even found that at least negative priming for that one. And so in a way, cross-modal priming can be quite beneficial for L2 speakers, because you hear it in your mind, but you're not as confused as if you've seen the first one. So obviously I've only used this in a few experiments, but I think it makes sense, because when I talk to participants after intermodal experiments, or like in the training phase of the study, they would be a bit maybe confused by the intermodal stuff. Even though it is an experimental design that's used in all populations.
And I also have a question was related to the first experiment. I think that you more or less already answered that.
Can I just say something?
Yeah.
Negative side of a cross-modal paradigm. You have to record the stimuli, which is not always the easiest if you don't have easy access to native speakers.
Yeah.
So in this case we did because it was still in Oxford. But it is something that when you're testing L2 participants and living in a different country, it can be a problem.
And because you have to have the perfect
Yes. Yes. Here we actually had a friend who worked for Oxford Dictionary as someone who records, which is such a coincidence. But when you're in Oxford, that's just like the reality. But obviously, I don't have anyone like that in Osijek. So if I have to do the cross-modal, and I do like the cross-modal paradigm, especially for L2 speakers, it can be quite difficult. So whether you go with what kind of native speaker, what's the type of the accent that they're exposed to, where do you find it? Not all native speakers are expressive to the same way, right? So yeah, that is definitely a methodological real-life challenge of testing in countries where you don't have native speakers.
So if you have native speakers, so sometimes it's hard to find the one that is very good in the
Exactly.
At least for Italian, it's hard because every time we have a different pronunciation. And there was also a question that was at the beginning of this, when we speak about polysemy and we see, I think the bank has 7 senses. There is here maybe a problem of polysemy and also homography. So the bank of a river is not like the same polysemous senses related to bank, like the place where bank stays, or so.
Most of it, I think what this dictionary did is put this under different word entry. So when it's an unrelated sense, then they put it under a different word entry. And this is not what we counted here. So we only counted the senses that are, to the institution.
Yeah, because of their right, of course.
Yeah, most of the time it's then separate in the dictionary. Thank you. Yeah?
Thank you very much for the talk, and I also had a question about your experiments and the selection of the L2 speakers, speakers. Did you test their proficiency in some way, or you just say, okay?
We did.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah. So we usually do a combination of self-report and a test. And there's this great psycholinguistic, there's this great short test called Lextail. You might have used.
There is also an Italian version that we just used, Lexita.
Yeah. Because Lextail has German and Dutch and English, I think. The original Lextail. And so it's quite practical because it takes 3 minutes, right? And so what I found that Lextail, obviously it tests a certain type of proficiency, but I feel like for visual recognition experiments, it's actually the right type of proficiency that it tests, because the Lextail is also a lexical decision task, just not timed. And I found, so in the last experiment, because I recruited advanced and intermediate, I would recruit based on self-reported proficiency, because you need to somehow invite the people in and then like know what their group is. And there was maybe 2 to 3 participants. I think I had to like exclude just a couple of participants because of a big mismatch between reported and Lextail. It wasn't always that they think they know more and then they know less. less. It was even sometimes the other way around, right? They would think they know less than they know more. But then in that case, it was a very small number of participants, but it did exclude, I think, then. But it was just a very small number. So usually what this showed me is actually self-report usually works quite well if you don't have a proficiency test. But I do like to rely on a proficiency test as well, because it's a bit more objective. So usually a combination of a language questionnaire and a proficiency test is good. Anything else?
Yeah, thank you for the talk. It was very interesting. And I have a couple of questions about this study, the Brown word corpus. I'm just curious how was annotated. It was speech recording, how was
it? Is a speech recording, yes. So it is a speech recording, so you can play the speech recording if you don't understand anything. I don't know if you had experience with other childless corpora. So there are many, in many languages, many different topics. Some have like the same topic in different languages. There are some that cover various children, some that cover just one child from for a few years, so different ones. And so this one is, so it doesn't have video, it has audio. And basically it was the same child and it was just be a recorder. In the beginning you'd have more recordings because it's a younger child, and then later on it's less recordings. So I guess they aimed for a certain number of words for each page. And it's annotated so you can, for the, so I think it's annotated for a type of a word, but obviously child language corpora is very difficult to understand, so it's not always correct. And so you have to sometimes, when you have to, so especially if you're determining metaphor and metonymy, you sometimes you have to read, then listen, then read, then listen, then ask your collaborators what they think, and then in the end, after all of that work, you have to reject the example because nothing, you can't understand it.
And I was wondering if you check the frequency of also some abstract words, pure abstract words,
no,
to see when they were acquired. If they were acquired also in the same time of metaphor and figurative language.
No. But it could be something that we can check because we have like the list of all the words and to see when they first appear.
So
first cool.
Abstract, more abstract sense, not figurative. So don't link it to a concrete element.
Yes.
And then another thing. No, I'm very surprised about this ambiguity advantage effect. Because,
for the L1s?
Yeah, because
me too.
Usually we know in psycholinguistics the completeness effect, and we always say that abstract meanings are more difficult also because they point to a different situation, different meaning, different sense. So people can have
the ambiguity effect is about the number of senses, not the type of the senses.
Yeah.
So it can be anything, and I don't think, I might be wrong, but I don't think the previous literature actually talked about the type of the meanings. It's just the number and how this number of sentences, how it affects processing. But it's such an old effect and like such a famous one, but I'm also surprised, maybe because I'm an alto speaker. I don't know, like when I think about English, but this should hold for all languages. It's not like English bound phenomenon. But yeah, so I think
because ambiguity is also a kind of uncertainty. You don't know which. But maybe, as you said before, is an advantage because you have more connection activated at the same time.
That's the assumption. And as we know,
maybe with a different task, not a simple lexical decision task, you can see another kind.
That's actually, I think, one of these studies that caused this debate whether it's actually real. They use a different task. Right? But I think that's an issue in psycholinguistics always. Whether we have comparable results when we use different tasks and different things.
Yeah. Another thing, but just I can talk later.
We have a question from home from Francesca. Hi, Francesca.
Hi.
Hi.
Hi, Anna. Nice to
Long time no see.
Thank you for the really nice seminar. I had a question concerning frequency. I was wondering if you think that it is possible in some way to take into account the frequency of use of the individual senses, because this might be a kind of confound, even in explorations of the role of abstractness as well. But I have no idea how you could do that. But
I see what you mean, and I think it would be worth looking into, but there is no database from where you can use that number, right? Because the number is how many times this word appears in the corpus. It's not how many times in each different meaning. So basically, if you wanted to control for that, you'd have to first get those numbers, and that kind of would work. So it's first of all, it's a word that cannot be done by a computer. So it's a work that cannot be automatized, right? So it's a word that a human might have to do. So I don't know. It is definitely something that could influence the results, but whether somebody will somehow have the the time and the resources to do that, I'm not sure.
Yeah, maybe just on a small sample.
Yeah, on a small scale.
Just
but then also, you know, obviously this would take a lot more time for words that have many senses, and it would be so difficult to also determine different senses, because first of all, they're all related because it's polysemy. So it would be hard work, but it would be something worth taking into account. Thanks.
Thank you again.
Are there any more questions, comments from the room?
I would like just to add
From
that
whom?
we can check for sense-specific frequency, but we have to look at corpora that are annotated for senses.
Ah, okay.
There are some corpora. Normally they are small corpora, sense-annotated corpora, but I was just looking at Google now, and there are some new corpora now, probably, yeah.
That's quite interesting. So I wonder if we could get enough words, because obviously in all psycholinguistic work, you first have to control for the regular frequency of the word. And so then you have to control for that, but also control for the senses and the type of sense, and it's a mess. But it's all of this could influence the results, right? So all of this could influence the fact that one study shows one thing and the other study shows another.
Okay. Are there any more questions from home? No? Okay. So, well, I think it's time to go to lunch. We are very grateful and thankful for Thank you, Anna, and thank you all the participants for taking part in this. And again, this seminar will be uploaded also on the website of Abstraction. And stay tuned on the website for new seminars. We will have the next seminar organized. It will be at the end of February, and it will be held by Professor Gabriella Vigliocco. Okay, thank you, and I will stop now. Bye.